Good afternoon. Thank you all for fighting your way through the marathon to come for what will not be a marathon of
Man, I'm tired too.
on a lovely Sunday afternoon here at Malvern Books. It's my great pleasure to welcome my friend Michael Blumlein to Austin. Michael Blumlein is a World Fantasy, Stoker, and Tiptree Award nominated writer who's produced a remarkable body of fantastic fiction while also maintaining a practice as a physician, mostly running a university medical clinic for the urban poor in San Francisco's Mission District over a period of decades, and raising a family with his third grandchild on the way. Michael first came on the scene, and when I first encountered him in the 1980s, when science fiction had one of its most fertile periods as a home for writers interested in using the sort of generic toolkit in service of perhaps more avant-garde aspirations. And in Michael's case, aspirations that coupled the profound humanism of a physician devoted to the underserved, the kind of unblinking honesty of a clinician who sort of sees the disease for what it is and calls it as he sees it, and the urgent yearning for political justice of someone who came of age as a 60s radical. Michael's first published story, Tissue Ablation and Variant Regeneration in a Case Report, published in the kind of seminal Bullardian journal Interzone in 1984, is a kind of great example of the marriage of these themes. It's a story that the science fiction encyclopedia, John Clute, called, quote, one of the most astonishingly savage political assaults ever published, in which a team of doctors eviscerate the living body of Ronald Reagan without anesthetic, partly to punish him for the evils he's inflicted upon the world, and partly to feed the world with foodstuffs generated from those tissues. The body of work Michael has produced in the subsequent decades includes the novels and novellas The Movement of Mountains, X, Y, and The Healer, and the collections The Brains of Rats, The Roberts, What the Doctor Ordered, All I Ever Dreamed, and Thoreau's Microscope, the last two of which both came out last year. His latest is a novella, longer, something that's even more sort of authentically science fictional in a way that I'm very excited to have him sharing with the world, which we'll talk about a little bit. And that's forthcoming from Tor.com, the science fiction, one of the science fiction imprints of Macmillan this April. Lastly, I just note that science fiction, it's provided a home for the work of Michael Blumlein, but his work is really its own sort of unique genre. To quote again from the Science Fiction Encyclopedia, at his best, Blumlein writes tales in which, with an air of remote sang-froid, he makes unrelenting assaults on public issues and figures. Even the opaque serenity of works like The Healer can be understood as asking hard questions about what it means to heal in a fallen world. He writes as though his aesthetic demands justice, as though, in other words, beauty demands truth. It's really beautiful and compelling work. Michael's going to read from some, and then I'm excited to get to talking about it a little bit. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chris. Thank you all for coming. I'm here pretty much because of Chris. We met, I don't know, how long, 10 years ago? Or
Yeah,
10 years ago. And he came to San Francisco a couple of years ago when Tropic of Kansas came out. And we hatched this idea, well, he'd read at a bookstore and then I would have a conversation with him. And some old Austinites who live in San Francisco came out. It was really fun. And so I thought, well, why not do that in reverse? And he said, come on out. And I've never been to Austin and just always wanted to. So I'm really thrilled to be here. Thank you all for coming. I'm going to read today from my new collection, which came out last year, All I Ever Dreamed. And the title is kind of a double entendre. The stories are 30 years worth of everything that I could ever think of, everything that I dreamed or that I wanted to write about. And the collection itself, being able to have all my work of 3 decades collected in one place that doesn't go out of print, what bigger dream could you have? So it's really a wonderful event. When you put a collection together of 30 years of your life, you can't help but think about the stories that you've been writing for 30 years and seeing them in sometimes new ways and reflecting on what would have been your prevailing issues and themes over the years. And for me, the things I've consistently written about are science and the ethical challenges and dilemmas that science faces, particularly medical science. I've written about this a lot and faced it in my day-to-day practice. Gender has always been something that I am fascinated by, how we know what gender we are. What does that even mean, what gender? How fluid gender is. And I wrote a number of stories about that many years ago, and I thought I kind of had finished, sort of said my piece. And then my newest, this is the new one that's coming out in May. Here it is back again, so obviously that's still with me. The human body is something that I've always been in love with, and on every level. In love with just having a body of my own and seeing what it's capable of and incapable of. And of course, taking care of other bodies and other minds. And this has been an incredible privilege for me, an incredible source of inspiration throughout my whole career as both a doctor and a writer. I didn't really notice, but in looking over however many 18 or 20 stories in this book, many of my stories have to do with these themes, about science, about ethics, about the body. And a number of stories, at least 4 or 5, are fairy tales, are tall tales, fables. And I've written in here, there's a story called Paul and Me, which is about Paul Bunyan, kind of. There's a story called Snow and Dirt, which is sort of a mashup of Sleeping Beauty and Snow White, kind of. And today I'm going to read one that is my version of the Pygmalion myth. Do people know the Pygmalion myth? If everyone nods. Pygmalion was a sculptor who made a sculpture of this idealized woman, and he fell in love with this marble statue. And Aphrodite eventually granted him the gift of, she brought the statue to life. In my story, there are consequences to these kind of wishes coming true. In the myth that Ovid wrote about and people before, there were no consequences. This is the story, the Pygmalion story that ultimately became My Fair Lady, the musical. So anyway, I'm going to read just the beginning from my story called The Roberts, and it kind of melds some of the stuff I've been talking about, a little bit of medicine, a little bit of science, and the other prevailing theme that I actually should mention is love and relationships, because every story, it was amazing to me, every story I'm trying to figure out what it takes to have a successful marriage of two people. And I keep coming back to that over and over at different times in my life, and it changes depending on when I'm writing about it. But it never goes away. And here's another attempt at figuring out how to make love work. Long before Grace, long before Grace, before Claire and Felicity, before the two men who wrecked his life, there was him and him alone, Robert Fairchild, first and only child of June and Lawrence, warm and cozy in his mother's womb. He was 2 weeks overdue at birth, as though reluctant to leave that precious, corpuscular, sharply scented, deeply calm place, determined to remain attached. When at last his mother, weary of a tenacity that at other less pressing times she would come to admire, served notice and forced him out, young Robert, shocked and indignant, cried a storm. His father was a physicist, an academic devoted to his work, highly respected and rarely at home. Robert was raised by his mother, who adored him, and he learned, as many sons do, that love bears the face and the stamp of a woman. He excelled in school, and following in the footsteps of his father, chose mathematics as a career. But midway through college, he was bitten by another bug and abandoned math for art. First painting, which proved beyond his grasp, then sculpture, which tantalized him. Sadly, his work was never more than mediocre. Some of it, by any standard, his own included, was out and out ugly. And these were not the days when ugly was beautiful. These were the days when beautiful was beautiful and beauty reigned supreme. His failure was discouraging, all the more because he expected to succeed, as he had all his life until then. He lost confidence in himself, a new experience, and on the heels of that, his spirit spiraled down. Eventually, he decided to drop out of school. But on the way to deliver his letter of resignation, he ran into a fellow student, literally collided with her. She was standing at the edge of the sidewalk, a sketch pad open, a pencil in hand, utterly absorbed in the rendering of an old stone building for one of her classes. Her name was Claire. The class was architecture. Their collision marked the beginning of a love affair that lasted just a few short years, but of a career for Robert that lasted a lifetime. Everything that was unattainable and wrong in his work as a sculptor was uncannily right in his work, first as a student, then apprentice architect, as if some slight but fatal flaw in his eye or his compass had been corrected. For this he credited Claire. She was his first great love. Through her he found his calling. Through her he learned, not incidentally, how sweet and vivifying love could be. She restored his confidence. She invigorated him and inspired his earliest work. In the brief time they were together, she gave him everything it seemed a man could want. And when at length she left him, citing his self-centeredness and preference for work over her, she gave him something new, the devastating side of love, the heartache and the sorrow. For what she said was true. He had poured his love for her into his work to a fault, neglecting the real live person. It was a terrible mistake which he vowed never to repeat. He had a contempt for mistakes, rivaled only by, as an aspiring young architect, his contempt for repetition. After Claire left, he had an awful time. Guilt, anger, loneliness, self-recrimination, despair, the usual stuff. He couldn't work, and that was worst of all because his career was just beginning and he needed work to feel like a man, to feel worth anything. And then in a freak accident, he lost an eye, and what had seemed bad suddenly got worse. An architect without an eye? How about a bird without a wing? A singer without a throat? He felt castrated. He couldn't see or thought he couldn't see. Everything seemed flat and drab and lifeless. There were ways to adjust and compensate, but he wasn't into adjustment, not just yet. He was into bitterness and self-pity, which were new to him and gave him a kind of poisonous satisfaction. It was during this time that he met Julian Tabors, a bioengineer and fledgling entrepreneur, and they began a collaboration that was to culminate in the invention of Tachyflex, the so-called living skin. But that was years away, and at the time there was a real question just how long Robert would last. He was working for a firm that his work was uninspired. He was getting stress-induced rashes, which itched and boiled and crawled along his skin. At length he was put on notice as a poor performer, but he couldn't seem to correct himself. With each passing month, the world of architecture, which he adored, seemed to slip further from his grasp. Then he met Felicity, who changed his life. Felicity was an oculist, which was a little like being a jeweler. She had long, expressive fingers, slate blue eyes, and a sweet, ironic laugh. She gave Robert not his first fake eye, but his first good one, that didn't announce itself from a mile off, bulging from its socket, making him look bug-eyed and cartoonish, or half bug-eyed, which was worse. He had developed the habit of averting his face, or alternatively, whipping off his omnipresent sunglasses and confronting strangers, forcing them to choose where to look and where not to look, willfully inviting their uneasiness, fascination, and disgust. These were angry, spiteful days, and Felicity put them to rest. It was a matter of craftsmanship, which he had in abundance, but equally it was a matter of caring and empathy, of listening to a client, connecting with him, giving him the look, the picture of himself he wanted. Felicity had that talent too, and Robert fell for her like a fish for water. The day she gave him his eye in a little box and helped him put it in, then stood beside him at the mirror, proud, almost protective, he was overcome with emotion. He asked if he could see her again. Gently she refused. He asked if he could at least call her, and she gave him her business card and said if he was having trouble with his eye, of course. He waited 2 weeks, then made an appointment. She made some minor adjustments, and a month later he was back again. Eventually, against her better judgment, she agreed to go out on a date with him. He took her home and showed her the design of a building that he professed she had inspired, a frothy concoction of steel and glass, his first new design in many moons. She didn't quite know what to make of it, nor of his attention. He seemed so needy, starved for something she was not at all sure that she or anyone could provide. At the same time, she was flattered. Several weeks later, he showed her another building, also inspired by her, then another, and so it went, until at length he wore her down, overcoming her resistance. He was only a man, after all, and if he insisted that she was heaven on earth, who was she to disagree? Putting wariness aside, burying suspicion, she stopped withholding herself. And from there, the laws of chemistry, physics, and biology, which, in the absence of compelling forces to the contrary, favored attraction, kicked in. She was already in some ways attached to him, and now that attachment grew. She looked forward to his company. She cared how it felt. And eventually the day arrived when she could no longer deny, nor had any wish to deny, that as near as she could tell, she was in love. It was evident in every facet of her life, at work, on the bus, on the street, in the kitchen, in bed. Robert was as fine a lover as she had known, attentive, responsive, creative, energetic, kind. Unlike many men, he did not despise or fear women, but rather he exalted them, on the whole a more forgivable offense. Felicity was sun and moon to him, and when they were together, he couldn't get enough of her, which made up for his tendency to be with her rather less, now that she desired him, than she would have liked. Thanks to her, his career was on the upswing. The drought of ideas had ended, the rashes too, and he was now working for himself, working feverishly, frequently missing meals and spending the night, and sometimes 2 or 3 nights on end at the office. 6 months after they moved in together, he won his first major commission, and in quick succession several more, each of which required that he travel. Not uncommonly, he was gone for a week at a time. As his business grew, his travel time increased until he was away nearly as much as he was home. By this point, the press had caught wind of him, the one-eyed architect, in their thirst for copy suggesting that his missing eye conferred a singular and authentic vision, like an extra sense. Privately, he would never submit to such nonsense. Publicly, he was shrewdly dismissive. Celebrity agreed with him and was good for business. He gave interviews. Clients flocked to him. Taxis, airports, and his drafting table saw more and more of him. Felicity, less and less. His love for her never wavered, but it was subsumed by a greater love, and she learned how it felt to be but a planet, sometimes visible, sometimes not, like Venus or Mercury. And like Venus and Mercury, she had no moons to orbit her, and none on the way, because Robert didn't want any. And so after many years together, she left him, and for the second time in his life, he was alone. For a while, he did all right. Professionally, he was thriving, and he had the occasional fling. In addition, the long collaboration with Julian Tabors had finally reached fruition. Pachyflex was now on the market, and it was revolutionizing the construction of buildings. A bioepidermic membrane applied to a matrix of polycarbon activating thread. The living skin took the place of traditional roofs and siding. It was responsive to the elements, thickening in winter cold and summer heat, thinning in milder weather. It also changed color, both inside and out. Its exterior surface responded to ambient temperature and light. Its interior, if desired, to the prevailing moods of the building's inhabitants. Neither surface required a protective coat, be it shingle, tar, slate, tile, or paint, which was a big money saver. It was flexible, it was durable, it was economical, but its biggest selling point was that it mended itself. The Dome Home, an award-winning, one-of-a-kind trophy home topped by a soaring, onion-scaped Pachyflex dome, which Robert designed and built for a wealthy patron of the arts, was a consummate example of the product's strengths. It was also an example, hitherto unknown, of its weaknesses. I'm shortening it, and I've written, and I've lost it. But I'm
Is this your note here?
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Pachyflex was composed in part of cells, living cells, as living cells were needed for it to work its magic. The cells, the immunocompetence of these cells had been enhanced, which protected the material from outside attack or incursion. But as enhanced immune cells, they were also prone to attacking themselves and damaging the material. 3 months after moving in, on the night of a banquet to entertain their 100 closest friends and celebrate their newest acquisition, the proud owners of the dome noticed a small bubble in it. Over the course of the evening, the bubble grew and slowly filled with a pale yellow fluid, which, save for its size, bore a remarkable resemblance to a blister. By the time dessert was being served, a frothy concoction of meringue and whipped cream, the blister encompassed most of the ceiling. The gracious guests, fearful of sliding their host, did not begin to flee until the fluid began to drip, and most mercifully were well on their way when, with a groan, followed by a deep bassoon-like ripping sound, the waters of the blister burst. As one of the departing guests ruefully remarked, it was as if the house, mimicking the inaugural mood within it, were giving birth. In the succeeding weeks, other reports trickled in of ceilings and roofs that puckered, but also fissured, ulcerated, and cracked, of walls and siding that peeled, scaled, and sloughed off in fat, translucent flakes. The living skin was acting, it appeared, as skin did. Troubled skin, that is. It seemed to require prolonged daily contact between its residents and the material, which is why the effect had not been noted sooner. The first lawsuit was settled out of court. The remainder, lumped into a class action suit, dragged on for years and ultimately came near to bankrupting poor Robert. Far worse, though, was the damage to his reputation. In professional circles, where the only thing more enjoyable than one's own success was a rival's fall from grace, Pachyflex became known as Fairchild's Folly. He lost business, he lost face. The rashes and welts that had plagued him earlier in his life returned with a vengeance. It's a common truth that misfortune causes some to rise, others to crack. Robert experienced a slow, steady, painful decline. He tried to work, but instead found himself staring at the wall or out the window of his office at the city far below, his city, bustling with the construction of new buildings, fine buildings, but none of his buildings. He stared and wondered what had happened, how he had ended up here in this gloomy, sad, unfortunate, and unproductive place. More to the point, how could he get out? The work he'd done, the joy and the pleasure of it, and the recognition he'd received seemed of a different life and time. He had dreams of Claire and of Felicity, and he would wake from them feeling old and tired, like a building past its prime. But every so often he would have a different dream, with a different woman in it, nameless, faceless even, but nonetheless familiar to him, the way a certain childhood scent is familiar, deep beneath the skin familiar, rudimentary, intense, longed for, yet unknown. These dreams were like whispers, flickers in the dark, and he would often wake from them with a glimmer of hope. And in time, after a number of such dreams, it occurred to him what should have been obvious before. He needed help. Not to put too fine a point on it, but he needed a woman. In the past, it had never been hard for him to meet women, and it wasn't hard now. Women liked him. And what was not to like in a man so charming, so attractive, so victimized by circumstance, and so willing to put it all behind and reestablish himself? Above all, he liked women, as opposed to disliking them, or distrusting them, or, God forbid, despising them, which for many women was a disincentive to forming a relationship with a man. Robert not only liked the idea of women, he liked the fact of them. He liked to be around and beside them and face to face with them. He liked their company, their loving nature, their adaptability, their strength, their subtlety of thought. Women were the brick and mortar, the bedrock of his world. Okay, I have about 5 more minutes. Every woman was beautiful to him, each in her own unique and special way. Throughout his life, this had been a constant, a source of pleasure and comfort to him, as dependable as breathing, or as thought, or it had been. Now, strangely, this was not entirely the case. Something had seemed to change. Their beauty was still there, but it was beauty in the broad sense, the general sense, the way a forest was beautiful, or a field of waving grass was beautiful, whereas any single tree or stalk on close inspection might be flawed. He met women and to his dismay noticed first and foremost their imperfections. This one was too loud, this one too quiet, this one too tall or too short, too bossy, too brassy, too shy. It was as if his vision had changed again, suddenly and inexplicably, so that instead of seeing with one eye, he was seen with less than an eye. He was seen through a veil. He was seen wrong. He searched for reasons why. He changed his diet. He started exercising more. He visited a health food store and left with a CD of excruciating postures and meditative chants, along with an armful of pills. He tried everything he could think of and looked everywhere except one place. And then, one night he looked there, where a good many others had looked before him, and a few had even survived, the mirror. What he saw was a man in his late 30s, a handsome man with a thick head of hair, strong chin, expressive lips, and a puzzled, somewhat desperate look on his face. The look was centered in his eyes, whose incongruity he had long since grown accustomed to, but which now seemed new and disturbing, as though they were at odds with each other, in conflict, the one dull and imbecilic, the other bright and accusatory, although the more he looked, the more it seemed to be the reverse, that the fake eye was boring into the good eye, the true one, challenging it to see clearer, to see better, to see properly. He thought of work which had given him such pleasure in the past and which now was so problematic. He thought of Felicity and Claire, both of whom had left him because of his inability to find the proper balance between work and love, or more precisely between love of work and love of them. A fine distinction. Love, he had found, did not parcel out easily. When it flowed, it had a tendency to overflow. It spilled from one cup effortlessly into another. When there was love, there was enough for all. At least that had been his experience. But not theirs, which made him wonder if perhaps he was confusing love with something else. Euphoria, hunger, self-indulgence. Perhaps he had loved not too much, but too much on his own terms. It was humbling, especially because he never intended to cause hurt or suffering. But it did seem to happen, and it hurt him in return. And if he could have changed, he would have. And now, by a stroke of luck or fate, it seemed he had. Finding fault with women was a way to keep from getting involved with them. It was a way to protect them from him. The moral equivalent of wearing a condom. A man had to feel good about wearing a condom. He had to feel good about having morals. And Robert did. Unfortunately, there was still the problem of being unable to work, of lacking motivation, inspiration, and desire. And to that there seemed but one solution. For while men were the builders, women were the miracle workers. And so he pressed on. The weeks went by, and eventually, after disappointment and despair, shortening, Julian took him aside. There was only so much a friend could take before intervening. Julian said to him, I know a guy. He used to work in the lab next to me. Then he did big things with a startup, but they had a falling out. Now he works for himself. Bit of an oddball. Didn't used to be, but who cares? He knows what he's doing. What's that? He's a parthenogeneticist. Good God, thought Robert, had it come to that. The idea had crossed his mind, but it seemed too dangerous and risky. It also raised questions about his own august self. In a word, it was humiliating. I don't think so, Julian. Why not? He listed his reasons. Julian suggested that he was overreacting. The process succeeded much more often than not, though of course there were no guarantees. Robert was skeptical. He was also intrigued. Does he have a catalog? No catalog. But he has his own line. Julian shook his head. He only does custom work like you. He's not into mass production. Not exactly like me. Julian shrugged. Build a house, build a man. And Robert thought, why not? He'd give it a try. He'd make a man, by which, of course, he meant a woman. What did he have to lose? So I'm going to stop there. Thank you so much for listening. That's kind of the setup of this long, long story. So he sets about to make the woman of his dreams. And it goes from there. Thanks so much.